Hello, it's time now for the newspaper review. This is where we're going to look at what's making headlines around the world. Let's begin with the process of deciding a successor to Pope Benedict. This is entering what sort of Figaro is calling its decisive week as the papal conclave gets ready to start.
And staying with Vatican City, the International Herald Tribune looks at negotiations with the EU over the secretive city-state's adherence to international banking standards.
That's more your bag, Alice, I think. Britain's Independent looks at a report by the UK's Parliamentary Commission on banking standards, sharply critical of proposed banking reforms and demanding tougher industry oversight.
And The Guardian leads on comments by Britain's chief medical officer that antibiotic-resistant bacteria pose a catastrophic threat, quote-unquote, of untreatable infections unless urgent action is taken.
Medical news in the Financial Times too, as a US pharmaceutical group sues Europe's medicines regulator over its plans for greater transparency on drug trials.
And returning to the International Herald Tribune now, the paper profiles China's love hunters prowling upmarket shopping malls for potential partners for men and occasionally women, paying tens of thousands of dollars to outsource the difficult search for an ideal spouse. What a great idea.
Alice, this could be you. When you're shopping, someone could be hunting for you as a potential spouse. Or Rolake.
I hope so.
Or Rolake Akinkugbe, who's head of energy research at EcoBank. I'd be a bit weirded out by that, actually.
Would you, if you
not that I would be someone, not that someone would actually tap me up. I'm taken anyway. But anyway, who's not taken? The new Pope position. Now, this is something on the BBC we are going... Did you see that?
Great.
See what I did there? This is something that we're going to be covering in great detail. We've already begun, of course, here on the BBC. It's all very secretive. They're all going to be locked away. Who knows for how long? And in Le Figaro, of course, it's dominating the front pages, as of many papers.
It is, and what is interesting, you already have some front runners. There's so much speculation over the last few weeks since Benedict XVI announced his resignation. And the interesting question, at least certainly from my point of view, is what part of the world will the new Pope come from? The Catholic Church is going through a variety of changes. We've seen over the past few years sexual scandals as well going on in the church. And then we move on to the next story, which is also at the Vatican. So the new Pope is taking on the church at a time of very difficult circumstances.
Before we move on, of course, one of the things about where the Pope comes from is whether or not the Pope should come from the developing world.
Yeah, from the developing world or developed world, but there's an even interesting side story, which is whether they're looking for someone who's an outsider, a reformer, or someone from inside the Vatican City itself, a Roman, as they're called.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We're still not really any the clearer as to who the front runner is.
And if we look at also, you've got the Vatican Bank now. This is something.
Yes.
You know, you've been looking at the banks quite closely.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating, staying with all things Vatican, is the secrecy that still surrounds the bank within these sort of hallowed walls, and the fact that it hasn't yet made it onto this white list of banks that adhere to normal regulations.
And it's quite interesting because this level of secrecy has essentially been in place since 1942. Now, the question is how much can European regulators actually intervene in the financial affairs of the Vatican? It's worth remembering that a large part of client base of the Vatican in terms of the bank accounts are actually the clergy themselves. So that the electors in the conclave will have to be thinking quite strongly of who would be the right person to also manage what would potentially be a radical transformation.
And just reading through this article, it brings out some of the slightly more gory details and history of the bank. It's sort of straight out of a Dan Brown novel, isn't it?
I mean, and the bank would argue we don't give loans, we only hold deposits, so we don't need regulation.
Don't think that's going to fly, really, when it comes to the EU. Talking of banks, banks under reform, George Osborne, the UK Chancellor, under attack again.
Yeah,
under attack again. And the bottom line essentially is that the Banking Standards Commission, which he set up himself, doesn't believe his reforms are radical enough. And this is going to really introduce quite an interesting power play. Centering around banks' reserve ratios, the Parliamentary Standards Commission in their report, which is coming out today, is going to be quite damning in its criticism of Cameron's reforms. Ministers say the ring-fence provisions will only be escalated if banks can prove they haven't adhered. But actually, the Commission wants them to take it a step further and give more powers to regulators.
But what does that really mean, this fantastic phrase we keep hearing, electrifying the ring fence? What does electrifying really mean?
Well, this is a question. It's going to be a real question of implementation. It's going to be quite subjective. The ring fence provision is to protect retail depositors and small businesses and prevent their money from being used for other types of banking activity, include investing in investment banking activities. Now, the point is Cameron's provisions are probably not being seen as clear enough, and the Standards Commission essentially want to give regulators power to essentially break up banks if they do cross the line. Now, what that line is still quite an unknown.
And all of this while Osborne and Cameron are defending the UK's position as a financial centre in the face of more potential EU regulation.
Of course, and there's so many more issues. There's a bonus issue. There's so many issues which are piling on top of each other.
And the criticism being led by Michael Tyree, who's become such a familiar face recently, and such a well-respected figure as well, particularly damning, I think.
Let's talk about superbugs. Now, lots of the UK newspapers are covering this. There is a warning, and I suppose there's been lots of chatter among people about whether or not you should take too many antibiotics, whether you should resist them because bacteria are developing to become antibiotic resistant. Well, now the medical chief has said this is a problem.
It's a major problem, and some have liked it as a real potential serious threat on the same scale as terrorism, for instance. Now, the issue is, I think, is the fact that there needs to be more research into finding new strains of antibiotics that could tackle these more powerful, deadly bacteria that we see. And I think there's going to be a lot more money and finances pumped behind finding new research in this area. Around 20% of bacteria is resistant to new drugs on the market.
Do you not think it's an overreaction to compare? Well, you say it's frightening, and it is, because these developments happen, but when someone compares it to the threat of terrorism, is that a realistic comparison?
Well, I mean, if it's a matter of life and death, it depends on how you see it. If you go into the hospital for an operation and you risk infection in an environment where there's no new research and development in the area of drugs that can resist this new strains of bacteria, then it's potentially a serious issue, perhaps for now not on the scale of global threats such as terrorism.
Yeah, I think so. Some companies under a bit of disclosure pressure,
exactly,
I would think.
Staying with the drugs industry generally, European regulators being sued by a US pharmaceutical firm about lack of transparency.
Lack of transparency, again, this is an interesting story because the European drug companies are arguing that actually this can affect and give its competitors an unfair advantage. And actually one of the companies that's demanding transparency with the European regulators is a competitor of this American company. And I think that's quite an interesting point. Now, the question is, how do you strike the right balance between what is essentially in public interest and what may provide a commercial source of competition?
Let's just take a step back, because what's happening is basically pharmaceutical companies obviously conduct lots of research, don't they? Just explain this. They conduct lots of research.
They conduct lots of research through all sorts of methods, animal tested, etc., some of which itself is controversial. And the question is, there's several side effects. And some of those side effects have been argued can be quite serious, and there's not enough disclosure. But the companies argue that this would affect greater transparency of their methods, would affect money that is being pumped into research and development in the pharmaceuticals industry as a whole, and that the competitors may be given an unfair advantage. Now, the question is, if this legislation is applied across the board in a fair, equitable manner, then perhaps the competition argument may not hold water in the long term.
But it's particularly the raw data that the EU wants disclosed, isn't it?
Yes. Essentially the raw data.
But what does this mean for the consumer? Because anyone listening today, while we're talking about this, will think, hold on, you mean the pharmaceutical companies are allowed to not disclose when the results go wrong?
Yeah.
That's the implication.
Yeah, but I guess you could also argue that people need to look at the actual type of data they've been required to disclose, and that can vary quite considerably.
So perhaps that's what needs to be regulated, essentially. OK. What would you do, Rolake? You got a little tap on your shoulder as you were shopping?
Well, I have got a tap on my shoulder when I was shopping, but for different people scouting for models. But this is really interesting.
Well, there you go. We've not had that either.
But yeah, this is quite interesting, because obviously China, the most populous country on the entire planet. And the fact is, actually, in China, unlike the rest of the world, there is an imbalance. There are a lot more men than they are women, which is what you would not typically get. And actually, these love hunters, you could call them Cupid's headhunters, essentially looking for potential future spouses for wealthy Chinese businessmen.
But this is an industry that has existed in various forms in other countries, hasn't it? I think we get very sort of elite bespoke dating agencies here in the UK, in Europe, in the US. So is this just a sort of natural progression.
Well, this is a natural progression, and the interesting thing about China as a really major emerging market is that these new sort of pastimes and then things that the middle class and the wealthy elite are seeking to do once they have been able to secure their basic needs is that let's move to our wants. And one of the key wants these days is to find a potential spouse. And, you know, they have these mass weddings in Asia, and potentially this is a key support function for those types of nuptials.
It makes me wonder, actually, because it says in here people are occasionally willing to pay tens, even hundreds of thousands to outsource the search for the ideal spouse. Whether you could trust someone to just walk around a shopping mall and knowing they've been paid that much money to have the expertise to pick someone that wealthy out.
Yeah, and I suspect there's probably a more rigorous process, screening process. Once people have been picked out, they probably have to go through some sort of agency screening. But it's quite an interesting
From
one.
this article, they don't seem to be looking for wealthy suitors. They just seem to be looking for sort of attractive, suitable companions. Don't they?
I would like to see their criteria sheet, actually, in terms of what they search to look at for. What exactly would be the main point?
I don't want to see the criteria sheet because I don't think I'd match up to what's going on. Who knows? Anyway, I'm not on the market. I don't think any of us are. Anyway, Rolake, it's a pleasure having you with us. Thanks very much for going through the papers. Of course, as we mentioned, we'll be covering much more on the election of the